Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Matthew Morgan. I work here in the Education Department. And for the next half an hour, we're going to be looking at and thinking about this remarkable painting by the English artist George Stubbs. This is a portrait. This is a portrait of a specific horse, a horse called Whistlejacket. And one of the things that I think is very remarkable about this painting is that it has a very universal appeal. I was talking about this painting, showing it to a group of people from New Zealand recently who were over in the UK to go and see horse racing. They were horse racing enthusiasts, and they were remarking how lifelike it is. They specifically liked the veins on Whistlejacket's legs. I was also recently talking to one of my colleagues about this painting, and she told me a story about her mother who loved this painting, even though she never rode a horse and had no exposure to horses in her life. So there is something about this painting, something that speaks to people regardless of whether you are a horsey person or not. One of the things that I think speaks about Whistlejacket is that he has character. He's not an idealized horse. He's not a stock figure. This is a specific horse. And if you look closely at his face, I hope you will agree with me that you can see that there is something individual going on with him. He is not just any horse. He's a real horse, or was a real horse. One of the other things that I like particularly about Whistlejacket here is the way that he is painted. From afar, he looks like he's painted with really rigorous realism. However, do get a little bit closer, particularly really up close, and have a look at his flank. And once you get really close, you can see that Stubbs has used some very loose brushwork. And if you just had a blow-up of one of those sections, it might look almost abstract. The other thing that I like about the way that it's painted is Whistlejacket's edges. Again, from afar, it looks like he's got very sharp edges. But as you get close, the edges are almost blurred, and you get that feeling that he's moving, rather like us when we move. So the other, I think, very remarkable element of this painting is what isn't there. Here is Whistlejacket. He's placed in an empty, infinite space. He's not overcome with any of the trappings of him being a racehorse, except perhaps for his horseshoes. He has no saddle, he has no bridle, he has nothing about him that makes us think that he could be ridden, or indeed is being ridden. He is wild and free, unfettered, noble, beautiful. So, why has Stubbs chosen to paint him like this? These are questions which are always very difficult to answer. The motivations of artists, particularly the further away from the contemporary day you go, are practically impossible to ascertain. And the case of Stubbs is probably worse than lots of other artists. He kept no diary. We have very little in the way of correspondence by him. He doesn't appear in many of the diarists of the day, Joseph Farrington, James Boswell. It's very difficult for us to get into the mind of Stubbs, particularly because we are left largely with his paintings. None of his drawings, almost none of his drawings, perhaps I should say, have survived. We know from the sale of his effects after he died that there was a number of drawings, in fact a number of sketch books. Where they are today, we just don't know. However, don't fear, we do have some way of knowing about Stubbs. And the main way that we have about knowing of him is a memoir that he dictated to his friend Ozias Humphrey. Humphrey was a miniaturist himself. And in Humphrey's own memoir, there are a few pages dedicated to Stubbs. And even more intriguing, the manuscript of that memoir has some additions put in by his common-law wife. So we can get a little bit closer, perhaps, to finding out about the real man. However, these are memoirs dictated towards the end of his life, and we know that there are some inaccuracies and some flat-out untruths. So we have to take a lot of these things with a pinch of salt. Stubbs, born in Liverpool to a farrier, a man who makes things out of leather, particularly gloves, a very highly skilled profession, but a very tough profession. And we know, again, from the memoirs that Stubbs really didn't want to follow in his father's profession. At this time, it was expected that you might follow in your father's profession, but Stubbs didn't really want to do this. And from a very young age, the age of 8, he started drawing prodigiously. He couldn't stop himself. And at around that age, intriguingly, he was made interested in anatomy. A local doctor gave him some bones, and he started drawing those bones. And that helped him to become interested in the workings of the body. A little later, aged about 21, he moved to York, where he tried to set himself up as a portraitist. To supplement his income, he worked teaching drawings, and to supplement that income, furthermore, he started working on anatomy. And he became involved with another local doctor and was hired to provide illustrations to that doctor's book on midwifery. These illustrations are illustrations of pregnant women. Now, let's think for just a moment about how it might have been possible for Stubbs to draw anatomical drawings of pregnant women. Well, the obvious answer is that he did. What you are probably thinking that he did is he got cadavers of pregnant ladies, and he cut into them to draw what was inside. Now, I think that's pretty gruesome. I don't know about any of you. It seems sort of pretty grim. But Stubbs obviously wasn't at all bothered with that. What he was bothered about was the fact that he, at this stage, didn't know how to produce etchings. So he had to teach himself, which says, I think, a lot about the can-do attitude of Stubbs, which is that if ever he had a problem, he just worked his way around it and taught himself how to get out of it. In 1754, he went to Rome. Rome, at that time, becoming the centre of the European art world as far as the British were concerned. For many rich tourists, they would set off around Europe on their grand tour, the end of which was always Rome, where they were expected to study classical sculpture, classical architecture, and through that learn about the highest level of art that had been produced in Europe. And around this time, the middle of the 18th century, lots of British artists were going over to Rome and living there and working there, and some never to return. We don't really know how Stubbs could afford to go in 1754. As I said, he wasn't a very successful artist at this time, and there's some suggestion that a local wealthy family, the Nelthorpes, might have paid for him to go, but we don't really know for sure. Intriguingly, he wasn't at Rome for very long. And we have no evidence that he studied anything or drew anything or copied anything. And in fact, in the memoirs, he told Esaias Humphrey that he came back from Rome and was convinced that the study of classical sculpture was not the way forward for art, and the thing to do was to study from nature. Now that, at the time, was a completely radical and outsider view, and flew in the face of the mainstream, not just of British art, but European art. And I suspect that maybe it's the older Stubbs, looking back on his younger days and putting his subsequent experiences into the mouth of his younger self. So he came back from Rome and restarted his career. Now, we don't know why he decided that horses were his future, but up until this point, he had had a very unconventional artistic training, largely self-taught. He studied for a very brief amount of time with a local artist, Hamlet Winstanley, but he fell out with him. So Stubbs, at this point, completely, really on his own. Now, one of the core elements of teaching art in the 18th century was studying the human form. And many young artists would study sculpture in order to do that. I have been told a number of times that when I talk about paintings, I tend to move around a bit too much. I get a bit too enthusiastic, wave my hands a little bit too much. So imagine that instead of looking at me and listening to what I'm saying, you've all got pencils and you're trying to draw me. How much easier would that be if I could just stand still? So if I was going to make a pose, for instance, if I was an artist's model, or even more still, if I was made out of marble. Now, imagine how much more difficult that is when you're painting a horse, who really doesn't stay still at all. How might Stubbs think about painting a horse which isn't standing still? Well, what he did is he used his experience in anatomy. He went off to a small village called Thorkstow. Again, we don't quite know how he could afford to do this, and again, the Nelthorpes are often suggested as his patrons. And he went off there for 18 months with his young son and common-law wife. And he set up in a barn a series of pulleys, which he used to suspend dead horses. He would inject them with wax, inject their veins with wax, and then he proceeded to cut down from the skin on the outside through to the muscles, layers and layers of muscles, all the way down to the bone. Imagine, here you are in a barn with a rotting corpse that you are gradually cutting down bit by bit. And we know that each horse lasted about 11 weeks. So I'll leave it up to you to calculate how many horses you can get through in 18 months. Huge, laborious, difficult work. At the end of 18 months, Stubbs had produced a number of incredible, accurate, beautiful drawings of horses, of the anatomy of horses. They are well worth looking up. If you find yourself in need of something to do, go and look at the Anatomy of the Horse by Stubbs. They are fantastic works of draftsmanship. He took his drawings and he went down to London, then the centre of the British art world. And he started to approach engravers to produce a book on the anatomy of the horse. And they all rejected him. They all said this was a stupid idea and they wouldn't be involved. So what did Stubbs do? He said he would do it himself, again, showing that kind of can-do attitude that he had. So he arrived in London in 1758, and the anatomy of the horse was not produced until 1766. So that might give you an idea of how difficult it was for him to engrave all of these very fine, very difficult drawings. Maybe the engravers were absolutely right. Perhaps they didn't want to be involved because it was too difficult. He must have had numerous drawings, many, many drawings. And for a long time, only the 18 drawings that appear in the book were known to survive. However, luckily for us, in the 1960s, I think 1962, a little package of drawings was rediscovered in the RA. So now we have 42 drawings that he made, but I suspect he must have made many, many more. And he was interested in all aspects of the horse, I think rather wonderfully, even horses' ears. One of the things that he didn't include in his anatomy of the horse was the internal organs of the horses. And we know from later comments that he made that he's not interested in the internal organs of the horse because they wouldn't help him as an artist. One of the main purposes of this project for him was to help artists to understand the workings of horses. He also wanted people who were interested in looking after horses, or vets and people like that, to buy the book, but his main purpose was for other artists. So you can see where he's thinking. This whole project often aligns him in art historians' minds with the Enlightenment. He is setting out to observe the world around him. He's not learning from previous artists or other experts. He is going out and teaching himself through what he can see, not through what other people can tell him. And this is one of the planks of the Enlightenment. Furthermore, he's not just learning, he's writing a book about it so he can teach others. Again, one of the very common things that people say about the Enlightenment. We don't really know what happened quite next, but these drawings must have been made available, must have been seen by other people other than engravers. Perhaps Stubbs approached wealthy men hoping that they might fund his book, or maybe he was looking for subscribers who would pay a little bit towards funding his book. We don't really know what the process of events was. However, rich men must have seen his drawings, because quite quickly, having arrived in London, Stubbs started to get commissions from some of the wealthiest men in Britain at the time. This enabled him initially to buy a house where he lived for the rest of his life in what's now Selfridges, in fact. The men that Stubbs was involved with artistically as patrons often referred to as the Rockinghams. And they clustered around a man called the Marquess of Rockingham, who at the time, as I say, was one of the richest men in the country. To give you an idea of how rich he was, if you were a servant, you might make £4 a year. If you were a vicar, you'd be very pleased to be making £400 a year. Rockingham could rely on an income of £40,000 a year. So if you think that there is a wealth imbalance in today's Britain, well, 18th century Britain would knock that into a cocked hat. Rockingham was very young at this point, but came from a world in which he was expected, in fact expected himself, to be a leader, not just of his own lands, but of the country. He lived in a house called Wentworth Woodhouse, one of the largest houses in Europe. It's in fact not quite clear how many rooms there were in the house. Nobody knew how many rooms there were in the house. And it had the largest facade of any house in Europe. He himself had been on the grand tour, had become interested in classical sculpture, and had set out to buy the best collection of classical sculpture in Britain and show them in his house, Wentworth Woodhouse. He and his friends were also interested in science, also interested in how science might help them. And all of these things, I hope you can see, might fit in with Stubbs's project, his project to understand how horses would work, might work, did work. Rockingham would become Prime Minister on 2 separate occasions and lead the Whig party. So he was an important patron, an important person. And in 1762, he invited Stubbs to come to Wentworth Woodhouse to paint his horses. He had over 200 horses in a specially built stable. And if you can imagine that he's already living in one of the biggest houses in Europe, you can imagine how big the stable for 200 horses might be. One of his passions, other than art and other than science, was horse racing. He had his own horses, of which Whistlejacket was one, and he gambled prodigiously on racing a sport for the wealthy then, probably as now. We don't really know the process by which Stubbs and Rockingham went about deciding on what Stubbs should paint. Again, that's somewhat lost to us. We don't know whether they sat down and worked it out together, and they said, well, yeah, this is a good idea. Whether Stubbs arrived with some preformed ideas and he suggested them to Rockingham, or whether Rockingham said, this is what I want, and told him exactly how to proceed. Personally, I suspect that it was a combination of these things, that they discussed it over a length of time, and they came up with some of their ideas in tandem, in collaboration with each other. But we've got no real way of knowing that. Now, one of the things that is very often said about Whistlejacket here, and I mentioned it at the beginning, is the lack of background. This, at the time, was considered to be quite shocking. And for most 18th century observers, this painting would have been unfinished. It would have been waiting for a background. And we know that Stubbs actually did approach paintings this way quite often. One of his friends was a landscape painter called George Barrett, who did paint the background of some of Stubbs's horse paintings. However, for Rockingham, he also painted other portraits of horses with no background, including one of Whistlejacket with the characteristic white band around his leg here. That portrait has Whistlejacket and 2 other stallions and one of the grooms, and is a rather wonderful painting, but much smaller than this. And I wonder, again, we have no way of knowing, but I wonder if Rockingham, having seen that original painting of Whistlejacket and the other horses, liked it. And there is some suggestion that one of the reasons that he might have liked it is that that painting, and possibly this painting, might have reminded him of classical friezes. If one thinks about something like, say, the Parthenon marbles, what they didn't know in the 18th century, but we do now, is that they would have been painted quite dramatically. But for art lovers, classical art lovers in the 18th century, they assumed that classical statuary was white. And so to have Whistlejacket against this background might very well have made 18th century viewers think about friezes, think about classical sculpture. Now, if that is the case, I think that's absolutely fascinating, because we are now suddenly moving away from thinking about Stubbs as a painter of almost radical realism, moving away deliberately from ideas of the classics and learning from the classics, to being a much more complex, much more fascinating artist who is fusing, in some ways, his approach to painting horses, this realistic way of thinking about them, and adding something quite, for his time, modern, this view of classical statuary, classical, neoclassical influences. However, as I say, we don't really know. One of the intriguing things about Whistlejacket is that although he was a very important horse, he was a grandchild of one of the first Arabians to arrive in this country, the Darley Arabian. There are 3 Arabian horses from whom all current and subsequent racehorses are derived, and he clearly was very close to one of the originals. However, he wasn't terribly successful as a racehorse in his lifetime. And in fact, Rockingham only managed to buy him because he hadn't been terribly successful. And by the time Stubbs met him, he had been put out to stud for about 10 years. So he'd moved from racing, from running in front of crowds, to siring other racehorses. So his importance, perhaps less about the amount of money that he may have made on the track, and more about the amount of other great racehorses that he can produce. The other, I think, interesting thing about Whistlejacket is that even at the time, he wasn't a terribly well-known racehorse. Stubbs went on to paint some very well-known racehorses, Gimcrack, Hambledonian, for instance, who were the most famous horses of their day. And I wonder if, without this painting, we would even remember Whistlejacket today. So this is a portrait that is doing something that portraits of humans do, which is making us remember figures who otherwise we might have forgotten. Stubbs, as I say, left very few records, but we do know that this painting was paid for by Rockingham in 1762. We have an invoice which refers to a horse as large as life, and a painting of a horse being a lion attacking a horse, which is a theme that Stubbs returned to again and again throughout his career. So unusually, we know specifically when this painting was painted. Contemporaries after Stubbs' death, who saw this painting, couldn't believe that it had been finished because there was no background. And there is a story that this is an unfinished painting and it's waiting for a rider. In fact, waiting not just for any rider, but for the king, George III, to be painted on top. And what would have happened is that perhaps another artist would have added the king and the saddle and everything else, and maybe a third artist would have added the background. So Rockingham might have got 3 artists in the top of their field to contribute to this painting. And this was a practice that did actually occur at this time. Personally, I have my doubts. I have my doubts largely because I doubt Rockingham would have started this project and stopped it, but also looking at this painting, it seems to me to be completely finished, completely contained. And because Stubbs painted other portraits, other paintings of horses without backgrounds for Rockingham, I can't believe that this is unfinished. This seems to me to be exactly what Stubbs set out to do. One of the amazing things that I think we can all appreciate in this horse is his beauty, is his nobility, the proud element of him that gives him his character, which, as I started saying at the beginning. And one of the reasons that Stubbs is renowned as being a great painter is his facility of capturing this kind of character in his horses. His predecessors in horse painting were people like James Wootton and John Seymour, who very often painted stock animals, horses that look very much as though they could be any horses. Stubbs went on and he painted other animals as well. I've mentioned lions, he painted leopards, he painted a zebra, he painted a yak, he painted a kangaroo. nonetheless. Poor kangaroo arrived just as a skin. His kangaroo isn't very realistic looking. But he was interested in animals in their entirety and interested in capturing animals not just as scientific specimens, but as breathing creatures, as living creatures. And I think in Whistlejacket here, he has absolutely captured that. Thank you very much indeed.